Between the late 1600s and really the middle of the 1700s, England was gripped by something called the Gin Craze, and it was also gripped by quite a lot of worry and anxiety about this, and the government takes quite a lot of action to try and sort it out. So it makes a really interesting little chapter in the history of public health. Now, the issue with gin is that it is alcoholic, but that isn't anything new in Britain at the time. All the way through medieval times, the people of Britain, no matter what their age, had drunk a very weakly alcoholic barley brew called small ale because it was safer than the water, which wasn't very clean. If they fancied something stronger, they could go to a tavern and they could buy something called strong ale. Now, this had more alcohol in it and it was strong enough to get them drunk, which it sometimes did. Generally, drunks and drunkenness were not seen as a good thing in the country at that time. Up until the 1530s, drunkenness was really controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, which had church courts for what it called moral crimes, and which could punish people for drunkenness. So it might fine them or sentence them to some time in the stocks. However, in the 1530s, Henry VIII boots the Roman Catholic Church out of the country, and then it becomes the responsibility of the government to try and cut down on drinking. In the 1550s, a law is introduced that says that all alehouses and taverns have to have a licence. They have to get a licence from the Justice of the Peace in their local area in order to be able to sell alcoholic drinks. I'll just write their names there: alehouses and taverns. In the years that follow, there's then a rising spirit of something called Puritanism in the country at the time. Puritans were a very radical sort of Protestant who were a sort of Christian, and they believed that drinking was sinful and it took people's minds off God. So they introduced a number of laws to try and cut down on it, and especially between the years of 1649 and 1660, when the Puritan Parliament was in charge of Britain. However, in 1660, King Charles II is restored and people start drinking again, only this time they start to drink spirits, which are much stronger drinks made of distilled alcohol. One that they're fond of is brandy, but when Britain goes to war with France, drinking brandy is seen as unpatriotic, and instead people turn to a drink from Holland that was brought over, apparently, by William III, who was Dutch, in 1688, when he became king. And it's called Geneva. That's what the Dutch call it. That's fine until 1689. The government bans imports of this drink to encourage people to make it in the country. Making this drink, by the way, is called distilling. It happens in a distillery. It's done by distillers, just in case you were wondering. And the people of Britain, therefore, they start to distill this drink. Now, the Dutch Geneva wasn't all that strong. I mean, it was much, much stronger than beer. All spirits are strong, but it was about 30% alcohol. The drink that is brewed in Britain, that becomes known as gin, is much, much stronger than that. But it's also much less pure, and it has far more impurities, and it's actually a lot more dangerous. There are stories about people going blind when they drink this. Probably the best thing to compare it to would be the moonshine that some people made in their bathtubs in 1920s Prohibition America. It's very strong. It's not necessarily safe to drink, but from 1689, it is suddenly very, very cheap and very, very available. So in 1689, cheap gin floods the market and people begin to open up all sorts of gin cellars. Sometimes this would literally be the cellar of somebody's house, dark and damp and smelly. You could go there to drink. And gin shops. And sometimes they would just sell it from a barrow. Famously, the sign that some of them would put up outside their shops would read, "Drunk for a penny," "Dead drunk for twopence," and then, because the idea was that you'd get so drunk that you'd collapse into your bed, which would probably be a heap of straw, they'd call it clean straw for nothing. Clean was probably a bit optimistic. So it was possible for people to go and get really, really drunk on this gin very, very cheaply, and a lot of them did. By the 1720s, this is a serious health and social problem. Now, in their defence, I think it's probably worth pointing out that life in 1700s London was very, very hard, particularly for poor people. People were cold and they were hungry and they were pretty much always not very clean. So gin, which could get them very drunk very quickly and help them forget about the way that they felt for a little while, became really, really popular. But along with that come an awful lot of associated problems. So, for example, there's an increase in crime. There always is with alcohol, partly because it makes people more likely to be victims because they're not very aware of their surroundings, partly because when people have had a drink, they might be more volatile, they might be more likely to get into fights and attack people and so on and so forth. So it leads to a massive rise in crime. It also leads to health problems because obviously drinking very, very, very strong alcohol that isn't very pure isn't very good for you. It also generates a lot of family breakdown, even if it doesn't hurt people's health, because they're drunk, they're really not as concerned about staying on top of their lifestyles and making sure that their house is clean and that their family are fed and that they're working for a living. And because of that, these are really things that you need to stay on top of in 1700s London. So it leads to an awful lot of problems there. One of the most famous stories that does the rounds at the time is the story of a woman called Judith Dufour, which happens in apparently 1734, when she strangled her 2-year-old son so she could sell his clothes in order to buy some gin. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I really hope it's not. But there are a lot of stories doing the rounds at the time about how gin was causing family breakdown and it was causing child abuse and it was causing all kinds of terrible situations in these poor families. There's also a really big increase in the death rate because this gin just isn't very good for people. And so by the 1720s, the government has decided to act. In 1729, it introduces its first law. Now, I really like these laws just from the point of view that they've got really nice little names and they all have the same name. They're called the Gin Act. So this is a 1729 Gin Act. And in this law, the government puts a tax on the distillers. So for every gallon of gin that the distillers make, the government puts a 5-shilling tax on it. And anybody who sells gin in a gin shop or a gin cellar is supposed to have a license that costs them £20 a year to buy. And the government thinks that the added cost of making and selling gin will put people off doing it. However, the problem is that there are by now so many people making and selling gin that it's really impossible to check up on them. By 1730, for example, apparently there were 7,000 gin shops in London, as well as 10 million gallons of gin being distilled, and 1,500 distilleries. It's just impossible to make people pay these taxes and these license fees because the government doesn't know who all of them are and it can't catch up with them all. Non-deterred, they try again in 1736 with the 1736 Gin Act. And for this one, they increased the tax on a gallon of gin to 20 shillings. And they increased the cost of the licence that gin sellers have to £50. However, they have exactly the same problem as before, which is that they can't catch up with all the people who are making and selling the gin, so they can't make them pay more money. In 1743, they have another go, and this time, so 1743 is about here, they make it illegal in the 1743 Gin Act for anybody to sell gin unless they are already an alehouse or a tavern. So the 1743 Gin Act makes it illegal for anybody except an alehouse or a tavern, with a sign outside like that, to sell gin. And that's, the government hopes that will cut down on the gin sellers and the gin shops and the people selling gin out of barrows. However, it really doesn't make much difference again, because again, the government can't catch up with these people. So eventually, in 1751, it introduces an act that really makes a bit of a difference. This is the 1751 Gin Act. And what this one does is it gives out punishments for people who illegally sell gin. The first time they do it, they're sent to prison for a while. The second time they're caught doing it, they could be whipped. The third time that they're caught doing it, the law says that they should be transported. That was a punishment where people were sent to very far away colonies, like the ones in North America or the West Indies, where they would have to work for free and probably would never come home. So that's enough of a threat really to cut down on the illegal gin selling. However, in 1750, there were now 11 million gallons of gin being distilled. So there's still a lot of gin around and it remains a problem. Now, just to finish up, I'm going to show you this picture. Ideally, it'd be best if you look it up yourself and take a proper look at it. One of the things that comes out of the gin craze is the fact that a lot of upper class people really don't approve of the way that a lot of poor people live their lives. This is a picture called Gin Lane by William Hogarth, drawn in 1751. He was very, very critical of the gin craze. Another commentator, whose name was Thomas Fielding, said that gin will infallibly destroy a great part of inferior people. So another aspect of the gin craze is that it's seen as being a very working class, very sort of low class, undesirable sort of a problem. And it really upsets a lot of the upper classes from that point of view. But although drinking remains a problem in Britain at the time, the 1751 law does cut down on the worst excesses of the gin craze, and some historians reckon that this is actually one of the reasons why the population started to grow after 1750.